Hello, friends. Robert Jacobson here. I'm with my friends Frank White and Keegan Kirkpatrick. It's July 20th, 2021, which many of you know is the day the Apollo 11 landed, but it is also the very first human flight of a human crewed flight of Blue Origin's New Shepard, excuse me. And what I want to first share is that the significance of this is you get caught upon all the news shares about billionaires in space and it's just a race, but this is actually something so much bigger than that. This was the first purely commercial mission we've ever had. Jeff Bezos owns 100% of Blue Origin. He's been working on this for 20 years. And this mission today had a paid customer. So I had the CEO, Jeff Bezos, the owner. I think he has a CEO at Blue Origin. He's got his brother, Mark Bezos. He had this young man named Oliver, an 18-year-old. And then he had Wally Funk, who's become the oldest astronaut until Frank unseats her position. And so there's so many things to impress upon everyone, but having this first truly commercial manned mission, and now this is the third human rated vehicle that we have here in the U.S. along with SpaceX and Virgin Galactic, is really going to be a wonderful asset to have here in the United States and for the rest of the world. And Jeff Bezos has been talking about this vision since 1982. When he was graduating from a high school in the Miami area, and he was the valedictorian. And in his speech, he talked about how he dreamed of one day being able to build hotels, yachts, space stations in space. And Amazon is just one part. It was the catalyst that allowed him to have the financial resources to do this. And we've had plenty of other rich people who could have invested in space, but Jeff really sees this not just as a stunt, but as a way to really open the cosmos to all of humanity. And I'm going to let Frank expound upon what some of those opportunities and what we're going to potentially do, because it's not just about joyrides, although there was so much, as it was shared earlier in a phone call earlier this morning, someone shared there is so much joy in those astronauts up there. And there's nothing wrong with experiencing joy. We'd rather have a lot more joy than sadness in this world. So Frank, how did you feel about today? And maybe share just any of your impressions.
Yes, so many impressions, Robert. Thank you so much. I would say, first of all, that you can look at any event and tell a story about it depending on your particular worldview. My worldview is shaped by the idea of the overview effect. I've interviewed more than 40 astronauts, mostly professionals. They all come back with this story of seeing the Earth from orbit or the moon and how profoundly it impacts them. So for many years, since 1987, when I wrote the first edition of the book, it's been clear to me that this would be a great experience for everyone on Earth to have. And I've been saying it should be a human right for everyone to have it. And it was clear to me there were two ways to do it. One, we would have commercial space flight, and the other would be we would have simulations like virtual reality. Now, both of those things are happening. So where one person would look at the past 2 weeks and say, billionaire space race, joyride for the rich, certain terms come to mind, I look at it and I say, overview effect opening up for humanity. Robert, Keegan, we really can experience it now. It's really a matter of money. It's not a matter of being a superhuman NASA astronaut. The other thing contextually that comes to mind for me, two things, and then I'd like to let Keegan speak. One thing occurred to me is that we don't really know much about the Wright brothers today. We know they had the first human-powered flight or heavier than air flight. I did some research on them. They were entrepreneurs like Branson and Bezos. They were obsessed with flight like Branson and Bezos. They never married. That's how obsessed they were. And they succeeded at something many people said it can't be done. It just can't be done. When we get on an airline, we don't think about them very much. And I think that'll be the future. While there's a lot of focus on these individuals in the future, the focus will be on what it has created for us. The second thing I would say, this is all part of a continuum. It goes back to the Wright brothers and beyond, in the sense that Gerard K. O'Neill, who was a mentor to me and an inspiration to Jeff Bezos, had a vision of humans living off of planet Earth returning to some sort of pristine, natural state. He actually had a vision of saving the planet by moving so many of our activities off of the planet. Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, I think, agree totally with that. Bezos has really adopted that vision, and he talked about it today at great length. And so this idea that somehow it's not just a race, but it's a race to abandon the Earth, really, when you talk about Bezos and Branson in particular, the facts just really don't go along with the rhetoric. And so I see this as a major initiative toward making the world a better place, a major initiative toward more of us experiencing this profound shift in awareness. And I see it as a continuum. And Apollo is part of that too. Jeff Bezos was inspired by Apollo. Apollo 11, he was 5 years old. And it all fits together. And I have worked very hard to get the media in particular to look at a bigger picture. It's quite a challenge, as we know.
Thank you, Frank. And Keegan, do you maybe want to expand upon what Frank was sharing about how space can make our lives here on Earth a little better? And we had a conversation yesterday. You hinted about something that the Air Force Research Laboratory is doing and how that connects with Gerard K. O'Neill.
Right. So AFRL is currently picking up on a project that the Air Force, and I guess now the Space Force, has been operating for the last few years now, which has been an in-space solar power project. Last year, the Air Force's and now Space Force's X-37B little unmanned mini shuttle officially went up on a mission to conduct the first ever test bed demonstration of an in-space solar power system. And now the U.S. Air Force's research lab, which is their primary space R&D group, is getting ready to conduct a more expanded, dedicated satellite that will conduct the first ever, I guess what you would call minimal viable product for in-space solar power.
So Keegan, you got to jump in here. You got to explain to people who might not know what you're talking about. In-space solar power. Break it down a little further.
The basics is this. Solar power conducted in space is significantly more efficient than it is on Earth, around 50% more efficient. The basic idea is you stick a solar panel up in space and some form of wireless power beaming technology on board that, which is really what the Air Force is working on, that can then send that energy that is harvested from the sun in orbit around the Earth or at some other point in space where there's no cloud cover, there's no atmospheric interference, there's no night. Continuous generation of energy that can be then beamed to any point on the planet. Now, that last point is where it kind of really matters, because solar, like pretty much any form of renewable energy, is location dependent. It works better some places more than it does others. And with any form of power, that becomes a problem because now you have to start talking about loss of energy as it is sent over greater and greater distances. I won't get into all the physics of it, but basically the further away you are from where your energy is being generated, the less of that energy that is actually going to be able to get to you. It's a loss problem. With space-based solar power, this is barely a concern, depending on the type of energy beaming you're using, because you can generate theoretically unlimited sources of energy. Because in space, you don't have to worry about building a solar panel on top of the Grand Canyon just to get the maximum amount of energy that can be generated in the American Southwest. You can build a mile-wide panel for all you want and just continuously generate energy. And why is this relevant to what we're talking about now? Because what Blue Origin and Virgin and SpaceX have all been doing these last few years has been all a concerted competitive effort to drive down the cost and increase the availability of launch, which is essential if you want to start doing the really big, previously only in the domain of science fiction projects that Frank has been just talking about. So while these last two flights between two multi-billionaires might seem fairly self-serving, and let's be honest, they probably a little are, the technology that went into their development of these launch systems is the real story here. That technology is going to drive down launch costs and make a whole new range of applications of space travel possible that we couldn't even dreamt of even 10 years ago.
And so we're talking about, when you talking about just space-based solar power, is powering potentially, whether it's manufacturing and factories in space, which is ideas that Jeff Bezos wants to do to take the dirtier activities that humanity currently is involved with to bring that in space, or bringing low cost and plentiful energy to everyone on the planet. And as I think Jeff talked about at some point, that he sees that living in a future where we're more resource constrained, especially around energy, looks like a more sad future. It's not as bright. But if we think about a future where we have more energy, not that efficiency is a great thing, we should try to be more efficient as a species, but if we can have more energy to do really great things in a cleaner way, that's going to be good for not just humanity, but for the best spaceship we have currently, which is here, Mother Earth, Gaia. And Frank, did any of the environmental parts of this, does that resonate you when you're thinking about space, such as it does with Jeff Bezos? Do you think about some of those concerns? Because I'm sitting here in the state of Washington, the San Juan Islands, and it's unbelievably beautiful up here, but there's immense critical challenges they're facing with up here that already being affected by climate change. Mm-hmm. So I know many people who might be listening to this might already be thinking, saying, gosh, we have these other issues that are pressing it, and they're pending. They're not even pending. They're already affecting humanity right now. Is it an either or? Do we do both? How do we reconcile this in terms of the terrestrial challenges with the space frontier that we're opening?
The first thing that happens, or has been reported to me by the professional astronauts when they reach orbit, interestingly enough, this didn't happen today, but several astronauts have told me they cried when they saw the Earth from orbit for various reasons. The beauty of it, the fact that they realize there really are no differences between us, that we shouldn't be so focused on difference, various reasons. That's an emotional reaction, but there's also another reaction cognitively. They see that it's a whole system, that everything is interconnected, that what happens in Washington State affects what happens in Paris, what happens in Mongolia affects what happens in Oregon. That is the key, in my mind, to meeting the challenges of Spaceship Earth, is understanding systems. And the overview effect, people don't really get it for the most part, but it's a systems theory. It's based on systems thinking. And it's appropriate because everything I know, astronauts have told me. And that is a key that I think feeds into the whole idea of dealing with the environment. And we've already seen the impact of the overview effect on environmental thinking ever since Apollo. Those images of the whole Earth seen from the moon have really triggered and pushed the environmental movement forward. I think it's going to accelerate. I think it's going to get stronger. And I've never had one astronaut say to me, what I got from being in orbit or going to the moon was, Earth is hopeless, leave it behind, let's go to Mars. Haven't heard one astronaut say that. The astronauts who flew today, just like the professional astronauts, mostly talked about the Earth. They talked about weightlessness, but if they talked about anything really future oriented, they talked about the Earth. Once again, the one future oriented idea of living off of the Earth, Jeff Bezos referred back to making the Earth a better place. So yeah, I think they're totally connected. And I want to go back to Richard Branson, who was queried about the fact that critics say, you and Jeff Bezos should be spending your fortune on climate change and racial inequity. And he said, yeah, we really should spend most of our money on that. He completely conceded that. And he said, and I am, essentially. But then there's this other piece that is going to fuel these efforts to deal with Spaceship Earth's problems. I think it's like it's like a stock portfolio where you have different kinds of stocks and bonds and investments. This is one investment. And my answer really is no, it isn't either or, it's all. Let's do all of it. We have to do all of it. And I'm just going to close, and then I'm going to have to run to another commitment. But I asked Akihiko Hashidi, Aki, what he got out of being an astronaut. And he said, without the Earth, we're not going anywhere. It's our base. It's our mother. It's where we come from. And so I've railed against the distinction between Earth and space for years. We are in space. We can't be anywhere else. We're roaring through the universe on a spaceship. And all of this comes together, and we just need this new consciousness to come together. And again, one thing, I think this will be my last point. I liked the fact that the first flight from Branson was called Unity. For humanity to deal with these crises we're facing, we need unity, and we need to come together and realize we're all in this together. So, as you know, Robert, I could go on and on, but I think I'm going to leave it to you and Keegan and hop off to do another commitment. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So we had Frank White, and everyone check out his book, read the book, The Overview Effect, which I think is it the third or fourth edition, Frank? Fourth. It's an amazing book. So look that up. Frank, have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, Keegan, we'll continue. So Keegan, let's talk a bit about the international perspective. In the United States now, we have three human-rated space systems: Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and SpaceX. And we have another dozen plus American launch systems of fairly high technology readiness level being developed. Now, granted, some of those are going to be uncrewed, they're going to be taking satellites, but some potentially down the road could be adapted or reconfigured for human flights too. Let's talk a bit about like the engines on the Blue Origin flight. So they're using these BA3 engines, which will be used on Blue Origin's much larger rocket, which is called the New Glenn, that's being developed, and I think on the Vulcan. And the U.S. has had basically a long reliance on using Russian engines, which maybe a lot of the public doesn't realize.
We've been using the RD-180 is pretty much the main booster engine that is used by the Atlas rocket, which was built by ULA, which is the big Boeing Lockheed conglomerate. And the main reason we use that is, for the longest time, that really was just the best engine for the job. And the Russians had more or less a surplus of them after the end of the Cold War because they weren't using them on nuclear weapons anymore. And ever since the invasion of Crimea and the renewed pseudo-frozen conflict between the U.S. and the Russians, there's been essentially a freeze on the import of any Russian-made rocket motors. In one of the more savvy business decisions of Blue Origin, the DE4 engine was pitched and almost immediately adopted as a viable replacement for the RD-180. Now, the two engines are very different designs, but fairly similar performance parameters for the whole thing. And this flight is, in a sense, a technology validator of what Blue has been working on to create this new replacement for the Atlas rocket's main booster, and later the Vulcan, and of course Blue Origin's new Glenn vehicle, which is being developed right now as well. This is a pretty big deal because it allows the United States to decouple from a reliance on a foreign-made propulsion system, and for that matter, a propulsion system made by a hostile foreign power, and is really part of this overall move we've seen in the U.S. in the last 10 years or so to try to bring elements of its industrial plant back to the mainland. So this is a big deal for that. For me, what I think is an important thing to note is that this is only the 9th flight in history as well that was a purely space tourist venture. With a total of, I think, almost all of them have gone to the International Space Station, for a total of like 8 visitors that have been to the ISS who weren't part of the explicit crew. There were 4 people on this flight, so that's 50% of whoever have gone to the ISS. That was conducted for significantly less capital. And the rate of non-scientific astronauts, non-military astronauts is only going to go up after this flight.
And Keegan, with the advent of this new system for space participants, maybe we should just touch upon that. You know, in the news, on the crewed side, people get described in the media as tourists or space travelers. And although that anecdotally might be true, back in 2003, I think there was a legislation passed that the industry said, look, they were trying to figure out how are we going to govern this and regulate this, that if you are a human crew, or whether you're paying or you're gifted a flight on one of these, you are what they call a flight participant, and that you basically sign a waiver, agreeing that, if something were to happen, you're not going to, there's certain indemnifications that are made.
And we're going to see probably more of that going forward as spaceflight becomes more common and the perceived risk really starts to fall away. I think the term spaceflight participant will probably be seen as an anachronism fairly shortly, and the term space tourist will supplement it. I mean, we don't call everyone who hops aboard like a Royal Caribbean cruise these days a sailor. So I think we're going to eventually see that distinction become much more commercialized, and the term astronaut probably become a much more journeyman-like term as time goes on. I mean, right now we're finally starting to enter an era where to be an astronaut does not require you to be basically a superhuman with 1,500 flight hours and 10 years of service in the military, or 3 doctorates under your belt, sometimes both, just to be able to go anywhere in space. We're going to start to see this shift to where more and more average people with more common skill sets are going to be needed, partly because there's just going to be greater demand.
Yeah, and so we'll look at the 3 U.S. crewed systems. SpaceX, the capsule is mostly an automated system, mostly. Virgin Galactic, they use a carrier plane with 2 pilots, and then it releases the spacecraft, which is, or excuse me, there's at least one, probably a co-pilot in the mother airship, and then there's is there 1 or 2 pilots in space in the spacraft? Now I'm
off the top of my head, I cannot remember that actually.
me neither, because I'm thinking of I think it's 2. I think they have 2 people in the cockpit there, so there's a little bit more of a airplane-like sort of feel on the Virgin Galactic side, even how they're set up, and then kind of an airplane starts as a rocket plane, comes back as a glider. Yeah, and on Blue Origin,
Spaceship Two is
pretty much an automated experience.
Traditional.
So I think eventually.
Yeah, Spaceship Two is by far the most traditional vehicle in the mix. It's even got a degree of mechanical linkage to operate all of its control surfaces that allow it to maneuver through the air. Whereas Blue Origin and SpaceX are really leaning hard into an unmanned system, which we really take for granted these days as just the way we would obviously use that to go into space. But really going all the way back to even the Mercury missions, crewed spacecraft either had no human input whatsoever. The Mercury missions were more like you were essentially just a ballistic missile that went up and then eventually came back down. And then going into Gemini, Apollo, and the shuttle, it was more like human operated, computer assisted. So this is actually a pretty significant shift. And NASA was a little nervous about it in the beginning phases of this, moving to an entirely unpiloted system for its crewed space vehicles.
And thanks, Keegan. And since we didn't really do a lengthy introduction, I want to make sure that people know that you are Keegan Kirkpatrick. You're a former aerospace engineer. You're kind of a desert rat working out like Mast and Space Systems. He's now the CEO and co-founder of an additive manufacturing company called RedWorks, co-host of Brave New Space, and my colleague with Space Advisors. So we work on a lot of different things together. And Keegan, this is something you have way more expertise than I would, but on the propulsion side, there's a little bit of talk about the environmental concerns and, Virgin using hybrid engines and Blue using liquid. But I've seen some analysis that essentially, even if all these vehicles were flying at scale, the emissions issue is so marginal, globally. It would literally, you'd have to have like almost millions of these things flying to have any issue. So I think there is an unnecessary, from what I've read, an unnecessary concern in terms of the environmental impact from rockets, frankly.
Yes and no. Right now, I can't remember off the top of my head what Blue Origin uses its main propellant, but I think it's a peroxide-based propulsion system that they were testing originally, and they're moving into something that's more RP1 and LOX hydrogen as their main systems. So not a lot of carbon emissions from that. The dirtiest rocket by far that I'm aware of is definitely going to be Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two. That uses a hybrid rocket motor called Rocket Motor 2, which runs on nitrous oxide and see if I can even pronounce this correctly. Hydroxyl terminated polybutadiene or something like that. Basically, tire rubber is what that is. So Spaceship Two runs on a tire fire, basically, to get itself to orbit. That is unlikely to be the propulsion system they continue to use when they transition over to Spaceship 3, which is supposed to be their slightly larger, more mature vehicle. And that's purely because hybrid rocket motors don't really scale very well. They work fairly well in smaller sounding rockets. They don't work once you scale them up. You get a lot of turbulent problems, and the whole thing just ends up being more trouble than it's worth. And that was one of the big problems they were trying to solve with Spaceship Two, why it took so long to get them to this point. It's a very impressive piece of engineering, but I would be very surprised if they stuck with a purely hybrid launch propulsion system going forward. And then finally, you have SpaceX with the Falcon and Starship vehicles they're developing. Falcon currently runs on LOX hydrogen. The Starship is going to run on cryogenically cooled, so supercooled liquid oxygen and supercooled liquid methane. Methane only has one carbon atom and 3 hydrogen atoms. It's dirtier than pure hydrogen, but compared to what jet engines run on, which is essentially just a really refined version of kerosene, it's really not that bad, all things considered. So I understand where the concern is coming from. I think Virgin Galactic is going to have to answer, is going to have to deal with those concerns going forward. But really, I don't see this as a huge issue for them when it comes to trying to refine the technology. They'll probably go to a liquid system that is nowhere near as dirty as this hybrid system they currently use.
And I looked it up. Blue Origin's the new Shepherd is using liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen.
Right.
And a variation of these engines will be used on the upper stage of the New Glenn, which is the larger rocket I'd alluded to much earlier.
And since the BE-4 has to go on board an Atlas rocket, it's already got to be compliant with the LOX hydrogen mix that vehicle uses as well.
And we'll go. Let's go back to let's go to business and commerce. So people are thinking, well, what types of things can we do? You know, and we go to Frank saying, look, we had the Wright brothers who over 100 years ago developed something that today looks fairly simple, but had never been done before. And now every day, thousands of people get on airplanes, no problem. It's just a very ordinary part of daily life for many. And this transportation infrastructure that's being developed could allow some of these things. So, you won't have to have a background in astronautics. You will be one could in the potentially near to mid future just be a passenger. And if you have an idea, whether it's for recreational, commerce, or something else that's novel, do that activity in space, and maybe it's just again for recreation, or maybe it's for commerce, and start opening the door of the space frontier. And we're going to be seeing these I think we'll see new careers, new products, new services, all open because of what we've been seeing over the past few weeks and even many months with group like SpaceX. So I think it's all basically being these people, and yes, they are guys right now, like Elon, Richard, and Jeff, are essentially investing in a new form of infrastructure. And we got to start thinking of the rockets as an infrastructure, and eventually we're going to have places to go to, stations and habitats, and maybe lunar bases. And in between there are going to be applications and services that are going to be derived from having that easier access to.
Right. And I'd say the Wright brothers comparison is actually not the right one to go with here. The closest person to compare to the Wright brothers was Robert Goddard, the inventor of the modern liquid rocket, not all that long after Orville and Wilbur took their first flight, and with about as much money. The Wright brothers built their vehicle out of a bicycle repair shop that they'd operated and really didn't have a lot of capital flowing around. What Blue, Virgin, and SpaceX are all doing is much closer in comparison to the development of the modern jumbo jet in the 1960s. Right now, this is a race to build the first 707, and the impact that plane and that type of aircraft had on aviation cannot be understated. Prior to that, the constellation that Lockheed made for Howard Hughes's old TWA corporation did a lot for this, but prior to about the early 1960s, something like fewer than 20% of anyone in the United States had ever actually set foot in an airplane. And that was because there was a greater degree of risk to this. We're kind of getting to a point now where I think we're gonna almost jump over the in-between phase that aviation had to go through and go from something that is conducted almost exclusively by governments and the military with very low volume to something that is done primarily by commercial enterprises at a very, very high volume. And right now, I think the biggest risk that the industry has is that we've gotten a little too used to thinking small and efficient. and we have to get used to the idea of working with a lot more launch capacity at much lower cost than we've ever even thought was possible. And that's going to take a couple of years for that culture shift to actually occur.
And this is going back to space-based solar power. Large systems, whether it's a large station, whether it's for power or for human presence, becomes a possibility when you start getting large, lower capacity lift, bring a lot of mass up. Because if and when we have, both Starship and New Glenn operational, pretty quickly we're gonna have to start thinking, what else can we bring to space? What else? Because you could pretty quickly take up the year's inventory of your communication satellites or whatever else you need, and start figuring out what are some other cool things that we could these kind of the unknowns.
And it is going to solve a lot of the social problems that a lot of people have had with recent changes in space flight. The amateur astronomer community has been really not crazy about the effects of these large mega constellations of 2,000-3,000 satellites, and SpaceX with what is it now, 40,000 satellites they're planning to do with the Starlink orbital internet system. They're really not wild about what that's going to do to being able to observe the stars. But if we're operating with a very large capacity of launch vehicles that can operate very cheaply at very high volumes, I think we might want to prepare for the idea of mega constellations kind of going the way of the dodo and being seen as a transitional satellite technology. We've all been talking about how the nanosatellite is the future. I think we might actually go the other way around with larger, more resilient systems with just a lot more horsepower behind them that can fill the need that normally has to be done by a couple hundred satellites. I think the problem might end up solving itself just by the availability of new technology. And that's just one area where technology is being developed by Blue, by SpaceX, by Virgin, by Firefly, by Rocket Lab, is really going to change the game. What I think is going to be the fun thing to watch right now is those companies I all mentioned are the ones who've been dumping the money and doing the hard work of getting all this research and really getting the basics of this technology done. The moment they're flying and making even the beginnings of a profit 5 years down the line, you're going to see the older, bigger players try to adapt and adopt their own technologies. So we might very well see low-cost reusable launch systems developed in rapid succession by Boeing, by Lockheed, by Mitsubishi, maybe even Embraer, along with Airbus. It's going to get very busy in this industry very soon.
And you have these companies that are hiring and employing a lot of people. SpaceX has thousands of people. Blue Origin had a relatively small number of people for a number of years. And then I think when Bezos recognized there really is he ramped up very quickly to now where he has thousands of people he's employing. And slightly different, SpaceX has a lot of contracts with NASA. They're carrying satellites, cargo, crew, a large standing army. Blue Origin is pretty much like 99.99999% funded by Bezos himself.
Yeah,
he's had a little bit of contract money from some government sources, but it's tiny. He's basically bearing that cost of the employees, the engineering development, all on his own. So it's quite amazing that he's been able to do that.
Yeah, the closest comparison to what Bezos has done is it's basically just rotary rocket with a lot more money behind it. Rotary rocket was one of the first genuine attempts to make a crewed vehicle using a private company. And I think they had all of $10 million to their name, mostly funded by Tom Clancy, I think was their largest single investor. And they ended up running out of capital right as they had built a uncrewed full-scale prototype. Whereas Bezos has got more money than God and can pull that in to be able to develop out this really ambitious system. The question now is that now that he's got a working vehicle, is New Glenn going to continue to be the design they've decided to go with? Are they going to shift to a more Starship-like two-stage system, or are they going to try to be a complementary vehicle that is tied in with a Vulcan and the Atlas program? So we'll see. The latter scenario is what they've been kind of heading in the direction of now, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some kind of a pivot the next few years.
And there's also another historical aspirational note. There was a program by McDonnell Douglas called DCX.
The Delta Clipper. Yep.
Yes, the Delta Clipper. I've met some people. I know a few people who worked on that program. It was in the 90s. And essentially, the Department of Defense wanted a single stage to orbit spacecraft. They did develop something. There were some flights. And then unfortunately, they got the rug pulled from under them, and they had to discontinue this program.
And they ran into the slight problem that McDonnell Douglas folded as a company about 5 minutes after that too. So
yeah, so Blue Origin did hire a few. Does have at least at some point had some engineers who worked on the original DCX program, and there was some aspirational transference there. And actually, I had heard that DCX, that technology, was eventually transferred over to NASA. So I wonder if Blue Origin was able to ever license any of that technology, if if it was a complete clean sheet. I'm guessing it was a clean sheet.
By the looks of it, clean sheet. There's not other than the vague desire to make a single stage to suborbit vehicle. There's not a lot in common with DCX with this. But I'm glad you brought it up, because DCX was just one of the more recent attempts by the military to achieve what they've been talking about since the moment rockets were a thing, which was this idea of being able to do rapid point-to-point delivery anywhere basically being able to put a group of Marines anywhere on the planet inside of 30 minutes. There was recently another paper pushed forward by the Pentagon outlining this, basically bringing this idea back. And while they did not name a specific vehicle, the concept art that they published was a large silver finned spacecraft that looked vaguely similar to what Starship is doing. So if Blue has a few people from the DCX program, I would certainly hope that they're advising him to go after the same thing that SpaceX is very unsubtly moving towards, which is to take after military contracts to be able to do rapid deployment of troops anywhere on the planet. If Blue can competitively go after that, they're going to be a real force to be reckoned with going forward.
I want to change directions to maybe the arts and culture. Frank White had talked about earlier that Apollo 11 was very inspirational to Jeff Bezos, amongst millions of other people. But along with Apollo, you had Star Trek and other forms of science fiction. And space has this interesting dance with science fiction. It influences science fiction, the industry, or just it as a sector or as a domain, a theme. And science fiction influences it. It's like a feedback loop. And there was
actually a documentary on History Channel about 10 years ago, I think, probably longer. I'm getting old. That I can't recommend people watch enough, called How William Shatner Changed the World. And it's just about this very subject. And it's directly citing all these technologies that were directly inspired primarily by Star Trek. And it's a longer list than you'd think.
And I think about, what artists or creative types have been checking out any of these recent developments, not just today, but in other places in the space sector, and are thinking about how they're going to create their own work inspired by this that might inspire other people, or if we might see new science fiction series coming out, inspired by this current emergence of this commercial and private activity. Because I don't want to underemphasize, as much as people, I still have some friends who, people, Star Trek, sort of, a lot of people love it, and a few people think, oh, it was kind of a hokey 60s show. And then it spawned there were many spin-offs. People are rabid fans of that show and other shows like The Expanse or Star Wars, which is, I call Star Wars more fantasy. But
That's a
As
debate we really shouldn't get into.
I know. But as we accelerate here in the space sector and really start potentially getting the technologies that are available for something like an expanse, we could see, this in space development and this migration of humanity into space happening much quicker and faster than we really could imagine. I mean, people like to talk about things now, the next century or many, many decades from now. I'm going, look, it wasn't that long ago that the United States had no human access to space. The space shuttle program ended about a decade ago. And now we have 3 essentially commercial companies. There was maybe some kickstarting or some help along from NASA with groups like SpaceX, but essentially we have 3 distinct space systems that are providing access to space. It can't be emphasized enough.
Well, we should say 4, or technically 5, because of Orion and Boeing's
and maybe even and potentially
those programs have had their share of problems. So we'll mention them as also in development. Partly because if we're going to mention Blue and Virgin, who are suborbital flights, we may as well mention the other orbital competitors in this whole thing.
That's true. Thank you for that correction. And also, their Sierra Nevada has their Dream Chaser program.
Yes, which is going up also this year, if memory serves.
So for those who are essentially non-aerospace engineers, maybe you have a creative field, and there are plenty of ways for you to take from this great vast domain and borrow from it and use it into your creative discipline, whatever it is.
And we've seen this happen before too. I mean, we just went down the path of how it happened in the early days of spaceflight and how it exists right now. And I'd argue today we've got more quality science fiction content out there than we ever have before. But this happened not so even further back in the 19th century with the rise of large-scale maritime ventures. Gilbert and Sullivan were as tied to the boom in new sailing technologies as the Expanse can attribute its origins to the rise in new spacecraft. And I think we're just very much like that period. We are only going to see more of it. It's what's going to be interesting to watch is not just the new stories that may come out of this, but how spaceflight takes a more direct relationship with Hollywood, because we've already got Tom Cruise getting ready to go up on board a Dragon capsule for one of his next movies, which I can't remember. I think it's one of the new Mission Impossible movies, isn't it?
I don't know. I don't know.
And they recently confirmed that the next Fast and the Furious movie after this one is indeed going to be Fast in Space. So it's entirely possible that that the Tesla Roadster currently orbiting near Mars is not going to be the last car to be launched aboard a commercial rocket. So I think we're only going to see more of that. And it's going to irritate the hell out of guys like me and other wrench turners in the industry who really do see space as something noble. But it's always a good thing for improving access to a technology means that inevitably there will be things that we will see that will be called frivolous, even though they're not, that will be perceived as somehow wasteful. And that's usually a good sign, because that means that more and more people are gaining access to this. And for every somewhat teeth-gnashingly pedestrian thing that is put up there, there's 30 other things that are being done that have direct, more global benefits. Personally, I don't have any problem with people trying to shoot movies, big dumb action blockbusters in space. I want more of that. Here's hoping that, though, that it doesn't cause a Kessler syndrome.
Well, Keegan, I think maybe we could wrap it up. I think we've hit most of the some of the highlights today, and for those who missed the flight, they can watch it online. And a couple other records that were made today had the youngest and oldest space flight participant, 18 and 82 82 or 83. Wally Funk, she's in her early 80s.
Yeah.
And then we had Mark and Jeff Bezos on there as well. So
82 years young.
82
Wally Funk, I was just pulling that up. Yeah.
Congratulations to them and the Blue Origin team. And hopefully it looks like soon we'll have probably more flights at hopefully an increased tempo once they figure out their, get any operational wrinkles out of the way. But it looked like it was a completely smooth and solid flight today. So hats off to them.
Yeah.
So, and I want to thank my friend Frank White, space philosopher and author of The Overview Effect. And he's also a professor at the Kepler Institute. If you want to study with Frank, he teaches classes there at the Kepler Institute. I want to thank him for dropping in to sharing some of his thoughts and impressions of Blue Origin's first crewed mission today. And I want to thank my friend and colleague Keegan Kirkpatrick for joining us on this sort of impromptu conversation. And you want to hear more, Keegan and I have a podcast called Brave New Space. And our advisory firm is spaceadvisors.com, where we're helping organizations develop their strategy for space. And so have a great day wherever you are, everyone, and we will speak to you soon.